All right, so this is the, I think, fifth section of my audio Uromastyx care guide by Phillip Lietz, that's me. This is the section titled Diet. Uromastyx are primarily herbivorous. Your geographic location may play a major role in what foods you can or cannot obtain on a consistent basis. Thus, the type of greens and amounts you purchase can be very different from store to store and state to state. Thankfully, there is a wide variety of greens and foods that can be fed to Uromastyx. Both fresh and dry foods should be included on the menu. I use the resource thetortoisetable.org.uk as a guide when exploring new possible plant foods or wild foods to offer my Uromastyx. The list of fresh greens that I offer my animals includes, but is not limited to, endive or endive, dandelion greens, Belgian endive or endive, however you prefer to pronounce it, turnip greens, escarole, collard greens, treviso, radicchio, green leaf lettuce, and arugula. I search for these plants first, and as backups or plants that I will offer less often, roughly once a week, are bok choy, mustard greens, romaine lettuce, and cilantro. In spring and summer, I harvest wild plants and flowers from my garden or nearby open space as often as possible. Some of these plants are hollyhock, nasturtium, phlox, dandelion leaves and flowers, alfalfa, grape leaves, grass, honeysuckle, vineweed, and vineweed, both leaves and flowers, and squash flowers. Other veggies and treats that Uromastyx usually enjoy are butternut squash, acorn squash, which is a favorite for my guys, peas, carrots, green beans, bee pollen granules, lentils, both dry and sprouted, timothy hay, finch seed mixtures, and spineless cactus. It is easy to get carried away with the foods these animals relish, like green beans and peas, but I suggest you limit these offerings to no more than once or twice a month due to their relatively low nutritional value. Bee pollen is an excellent way to get diverse nutrition to your lizard, but should be limited to infrequent feeding precisely because of its rich content. I don't personally feed bee pollen to my Uromastyx, but giving them a small spoonful 1 to 2 times a week is just fine. Seeds and lentils are very common treats for Uromastyx, although I only give mine access to either of these a few times a year at most, usually in late spring and early summer, so they're probably not a necessary part of the diet. Again, it is important to exercise restraint when feeding treat foods or dry foods. As a general rule, 90% of the diet of my Uromastyx is simply fresh greens and flowers, 5% hard veggies or treats, and 5% dry foods. The greens and plants can be chopped up or grated and placed in a shallow food bowl or on a bare slab of tile or stone. I add timothy hay in my enclosures both as a dry snack that the Uromastyx can graze on, but also as a kind of visual barrier. Every other month or so, I put fresh hay on and around select hiding spots in the cage. This can sometimes make cleaning a bit more of an effort, but the animals love the snack and will often mess around in the hay for fun or to find more food. There are many dozens of different brands of calcium and vitamin supplements for reptiles on the market, and many of them can be used for Uromastyx. I use a limited supplementation regimen for my adult animals because they get very high quality, full spectrum UV lighting, frequent exposure to sunlight in warmer months, excellent temperature gradients, and a massively varied diet. So most of the year, I don't add any supplements to their greens at all. When I see pairs mate during breeding season, I do start adding some calcium and just calcium carbonate and multivitamin to their treats, like Zoomed grassland tortoise food, to give them an extra boost while producing eggs. This usually is in the form of mineral outdoor formula by Sticky Tongue Farms and or Repashy Super Veggie Supplement, but almost any brand of quality calcium and vitamin supplement will be just fine. Be sure to follow the instructions on the packaging as suggested use will vary by brand. Dry foods are a great way to add more variety and to help ensure there are no missing nutrients in the diet. These foods can also be a helpful way to counterbalance the super wet content of fresh greens, which doesn't resemble their wild sources of food. Some good dry foods to choose from are Zoomed grassland tortoise food, offered dry or soaked or crushed into small little bits, Missouri tortoise chow, LS formula, dry or soaked, Repcal juvenile iguana pellets, or comparable dry grassland diets made by other brands. I prefer using Zoomed grassland tortoise food and the grassland food by Tortoise Supply this is a typo on my part. The herbal tortoise hay by tortoisesupply.com for my Uromastyx. I feed this to all sizes of Uromastyx in varying amounts, except hatchlings under a few months old, reducing its frequency or completely halting the dry food offering in the cooler seasons. I crush or grind the pellets with a coffee grinder and put them in a small dish. During spring and summer, the adults have access to this food almost every day and often run over to eat it as I refill the bowl. For babies under 4 to 6 months, I grind the ZooMed grassland tortoise food into what is essentially a powder, mix in a little calcium carbonate and multivitamin, and leave it in a bowl 3 to 5 times a week for groups of hatchlings. All species of baby Uromastyx I have hatched really love that mix. An important consideration in offering these dry foods is the time of year or the season. For example, if your region is nearing winter, it might be best to hold off on too much dry food to allow your Uromastyx to get as much hydration as possible in advance of winter. Another consideration is trying to limit dry foods offered, unless pre-soaked, to gravid females. At a time when the demands on the lizard's body are high, processed and dry foods might be a bit too taxing on an already hard-working system. Insects are an extremely controversial topic in the Uromastyx keeping community. This controversy, like keeping a water bowl in the cage or bathing a Uromastyx, is probably unwarranted. While bugs in very limited amounts are probably not harmful at all, they are also not likely necessary. In all my time breeding Uromastyx, I have hardly ever offered insects, and never in any consistent way. I have seen several of my animals chase down spiders that have gotten into their pens, and they meet a sad fate in the belly of an herbivore. I also have offered insects to animals that don't ever see interest in them. So they're clearly not a requirement by any stretch of the imagination, at least not in captivity, probably. If you choose to offer insects to your Uromastyx, it is probably best to limit them to once a month or less. It's also worth noting that the only insects I have ever offered my animals are mealworms, Tenebrio molitor, and most often I've given these to animals under 1 year old. Okay, so that's the end of the diet section. The next section is titled Seasonal Changes, and I'll upload that tomorrow.